Hello, historians, and welcome back. Today, we are going to discuss one of my very favorite topics in American history, the West, right? Where is the West? When is the West? Who defines the West? These are all topics we have to uncover and understand in order to really get the significance of the West in American history. Now, really, any period of American history you're studying is going to have some concept of the West tied to it. So really what's significant in this particular lecture is the context, right? What else is happening in America that is influencing the way Americans of all races, classes, and nationalities, what is happening that's influencing the way that they view the American West? And what is happening in the West that is influencing American identity? As always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Sherland, and I invite you to pull out your notepad, pull out your notebook, open up a Word document on your computer so that you can fully engage in today's lecture. You know, before we start any topic, before we discuss any aspect of American history, and really this is true of all of your classes, whether you're taking a biology class or a communications class, or maybe you're sitting in for a book reading, right? Every time you engage with content, you really should check in with yourself. Like, what do you already know about this topic? What do you care about this topic? It really helps your brain to create those connections between or among information pieces when you engage in it with like your own personal investment. So I like to start with what I call a 1 minute write. Here's a quote that I took from the American Yop, and I copied this quote in 2023. I'm going to read it to you, and then I want you to pause the recording and for just 1 minute, react to this quote. What does it make you think? What does it make you feel? The history of the late 19th century West is not a simple story. What some touted as a triumph, the westward expansion of American authority, was for others a tragedy. The West contained many peoples and many places, and their intertwined histories marked a pivotal transformation in the history of the United States. So go ahead and pause the recording, reflect on this quote, and come back when you're ready. Sensitive little mouse. Okay, welcome back. These are the topics we are going to cover in today's lecture. First, we have to define the West. Where is it? When are we talking about? What period of American history are we discussing? Because the West in the 17th century and the 18th century, a very different place than the West in the late 19th century. And whose perspective are we looking at? What perspective are we using in order to define the West? We're going to look at violence against and the persistence of Native people. We're going to explore American expansion efforts. We're going to discuss the myth of the West and wrap it up with primary sources in context. Most of the images you see in today's lecture are taken from a chapter called The West in the American Yop. Some of you have already read that chapter. Other images are referenced at the very end of the lecture with just direct hyperlinks. So where is the West, right? Here is an awesome interactive GIF map that was done over the course of 1750 to the 2000s, right? So you can, I'll link to this GIF in the PowerPoint slides. You can actually open this on your web browser and watch as the territories of the West, right? The territories of North America shift and change over the course of several centuries. Now you can see with what you're watching here is like late 1900s, early 21st century. But when you go all the way back as it's starting from 1750, the West was really differently defined, right? Spain didn't call it the West. Spain called it the Northern Frontier. France didn't call it the West. They called it Louisiana. So really, when we're talking about the West, if we're discussing today's topic, which is post-Civil War America, that's like 1850s to 1880s to early 1900s, right? So we're looking at how America defined the West after they claimed Louisiana from Spain, or from Spain and France in some ways, but France. And then after they also claimed what is today the Southwest in California after a war with Spain. So it's going to be different depending on the time frame that you're looking at. But we're right about here where the map's showing us, like 1880s. We'll wait till we get there. See how different it looks depending on the time frame in question? So specific to when, today, for today's purposes, we're looking at this date range. We're looking at late 19th century. And when I say 19th century, I mean the 1800s. That's just kind of the way historians talk. So really late 19th century, sort of into the early 20th century. We're specifically looking at post-Reconstruction America. So that's after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877 is Reconstruction. So we're looking at that period afterwards, right? So end of Civil War, end of Reconstruction, 1880s is really kind of our target today. We're going to look at previous control, like who owned and claimed the West at the time, settlement and conquest patterns. We'll look at native dominance, right? And we'll look at Spanish, French, and British colonial trade efforts. So that stuff down at the bottom, when I say previous control, settlement, conquest, native dominance, we'll discuss native dominance today, but really, we're not going to talk much about colonial holdings because that doesn't really resonate with our purposes today. So let's define the West, right? Where is the West? Who's defining it? Well, for a lot of people, it was never called the West. For a lot of people, the West is just home. And I don't just mean home like the house where you go when you're done with school or you're done with work. I mean your actual ancient homeland, where you believe humankind actually emerged. Everyone has a different frame of reference when we talk about origin stories. Some of us believe in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Others believe in scientific migration from Africa into parts of Europe and Russia, all the way over the Bering Land Bridge into America and then into South America. Others believe that humankind or human beings emerged from the Grand Canyon. Others believe that humans emerged from bald eagles, right? It just sort of depends on your frame of reference. And as historians, we don't lay judgment on where we think we originate, right? As historians, we're looking at the history of people. So who cares what's true? What matters is what they think, what they believe, right? That tells us more about who these people are. So for a lot of Native Americans in particular, this was never the West. This was home, right? This was homeland. This was origins of the species. And here's a quote again from American Yap. Indigenous Americans have lived in North America for over 10 millennia, and into the late 19th century, perhaps as many as 250,000 Native people still inhabited and claimed homeland in the American West. But then unending waves of American settlers, the American military, and the unstoppable onrush of American capital conquered all. Often in violation of their own treaties, the United States removed Native groups to ever-shrinking reservations, incorporated the West first as territories and then as states, and then, for the first time in history, controlled the enormity of land between two oceans. So what about others, right? What about people who don't see this as home quite yet? For many, the West was considered their destiny. Now, this is an image from the 1840s. So this is about 40 years prior to the period in question. But that concept of America and the West as part of American destiny pervaded through the early 20th century. So though this image is from a different context in time, it's still significant. It still anchors our understanding of what white Americans thought the West was. Manifest destiny persisted. The belief that America was called by God to settle the West, to settle this continent, right? That not only were they there to settle it through capital, economy, right? Agriculture, but also through spirituality and morality. The Homestead Act of the 1860s actually carved up spaces of the American West and created opportunities for maybe lower class white men to go out to the West and settle it, claim plots of land and claim it as their own, grow, crops, have horses, have ranches, have these small family farms. That was the Homestead Act of the 1860s. And really that became one of the things that helped resolve the Civil War. Was you have this crush of racism and xenophobia, the hatred of others, in the South and in the North following the Civil War, but the West was seen as open territory, right? You could get out of all that business. You could get out of all that nonsense in the North and the South. You could move West and start out on your own. And you're all by yourself out on the open prairie with nothing but acres, right? That you and your little family could start your own little place. This was also a component of class mobility. If you really think about it, the South was home to like land-owning aristocrats, freed men and women, so former people who were formerly enslaved, and then relatively impoverished whites, right? There wasn't a whole lot of fluidity after the Civil War for folks to explore opportunities of advancement. So a lot of African Americans moved north for industrial jobs, right? They moved north so they could work in factories, they could work on the railroad, they could work in plants. A lot of white Southerners really saw Texas, Oklahoma, right, Kansas, places like that as ways for them to establish their own agricultural dominance. Meanwhile, in the North, you have ethnic whites, right? People who identified as Irish American or German American. And they see the West as a way to get out of these crowded cities, these tenement districts where they're living in like really small apartments with lots and lots of people. They saw the West as an opportunity to claim their own little slice of heaven. And this is in violent opposition to the experiences they had in Europe, because in Europe, all that land had already been claimed by the nobility, right? They'd already been claimed by royal families. And so even though the West technically belonged to Native American tribes, under treaties agreed upon by the United States, mind you, it wasn't just like loosey-goosey. These were actual agreements the United States had with various tribes. All of these folks that were looking to get out of the crowded North or the complex South saw the West as a way to strike it out on their own. And in some ways, advance in the class, become from lower class to middle class or even higher. And with that's the promise of American individualism, right? Americans can strike it out on their own, pull it up by your bootstraps. You're on your own. You can do this by yourself with a little hard work and a lot of determination. But you can't just like transport or teleport from the North into the West. And that's where this idea of access comes in. This is the first time post the Civil War that the American West is actually accessible for these folks. There are railroads getting them to and from little settlements, like Flagstaff. If you know Flagstaff, that was a railroad town. People could get to Flagstaff in the 1880s because the railroad came through. And covered wagons created these long sort of hauls of pioneers who could move from the East Coast or the Midwest in some cases into the West. And there was also the belief of American duty spiritually to settle the West, as I mentioned, and do so with a grounding in Christianity, mostly Protestantism. For Americans, and white Americans in particular, the West was the frontier. And you might recognize this sort of concept, right? The North and the South on the East Coast were seen as kind of civilized, right? Orderly, in some ways stifled by European values, consumerism, right? A connection to material goods, sort of softness, right? That comes with high teas, right? And having a constant ritual or pattern of behavior. But the West was wild, right? The West was open. The West was a promise. So there's this guy in the 1890s named Frederick Jackson Turner, and he writes this thesis called The Significance of the West in American History. And his work is one of the primary sources we have from this chapter. And it's constantly referenced when people talk about the West. Any class you take, any history class you take is probably going to reference Jackson Turner's thesis on the American West. He's not even talking about the West. He's talking about this concept of the frontier, which is a line between sort of civilization and wilderness. And he's claiming that the frontier is continually moving west, 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 because America is constantly civilizing portions of the West through territories and through statehood, right? And he's saying, but the frontier, right? The frontier is what makes America so special. The promise of the wilderness is what makes America so special. And he was concerned, in fact, that the frontier as it was moving west would eventually not exist anymore. And this could change what America believed about itself. So for a lot of people, including kind of America, the American spirit, when I'm talking about the American spirit, I'm talking about white, typically men, landowning spirit, right? The belief that the West held the promise of what America could be. But the West was also home to violence against Native people. And I really encourage you to engage in the chapter, engage in what American Yawp has to say about different forms of violence against Native people. The first is kind of this like, it's like this term that's it's mythologized over time the Indian Wars, right? This was a series, as American Yacht defines it, of seemingly sporadic, localized, and brief engagements between the US military forces and various Native American groups. This would have been post-Civil War. So in a lot of cases, these Indian Wars, as they were called, and they were like in Arizona, they were called the Apache Wars. You could look those up. These were typically white military men who were kind of engaging in sort of Civil War era conflicts with Native Americans. And in some ways, they were looking to systemically erase Native people from the West to open it up for American settlement. But as the book explains, these massacres in a lot of cases, and this picture is from the Battle of Wounded Knee, these massacres were not the only form of violence against Native people at the time. You also have cultural conflicts. You have Indian boarding schools, which are the forced reassignment of Native children to Americanized, Europeanized, sort of anglicized education. These Native children were sort of taken from their families, oftentimes moved very far away from the reservation or their homeland, and indoctrinated with white American Christian values. Oftentimes, almost always, their hair was shorn. They were forced to wear uniforms that did not sort of relate to their Native dress. They were assaulted if they used their Native language in the schools. These were violent attacks on Native culture. If you drive down the street in Phoenix called Indian School, that street is named for the Indian boarding school that existed and still exists as a monument today on Indian School in near central Phoenix. The other aspect of cultural conflict was allotment and forced relocation. So over the course of the last 100 years or so, the United States government was entering into treaties with Native groups, Native tribes, and they were sort of carving out spaces of land where Native people could live and could homestead in an American version or in a Native version, depending on the treaty. But what they essentially did over the course of the late 19th century was shrink those spaces down, right? It started out this way and then it ended up this. So they're consolidating Native people into smaller and smaller places. This is a violent act, right? This is claiming and carving out territory that belongs to Native people, both in legacy and in actual legal agreement. But then there's also economic conflicts, right? There's land grabs. The Homestead Act was just that, right? It was a federal policy to allow white settlers to essentially go out and claim hundreds of acres of Native land. The Homestead Act and land grabs had to do with like Americans trying to, remember, they believed this was open space that was really theirs for the taking. And in some ways they were doing their duty, right? And then there's also squatters' rights. People could just move into territory. Look into the history of California after the Gadsden Purchase and the US-Mexican War. White settlers just moved on to Mexican claimed territory or California claimed territory and just squatted there. They didn't have any sort of deed. They didn't have any mortgage. They didn't have a rental lease. They just lived there. And over time, the federal government came to recognize them as the proper or authoritative landholders. But Native people persisted, and this is so important when we study the West. White Americans talked about Native Americans at this time, and still really did until about the 1950s, as if they were dying out, as if they were becoming extinct. And in some cases, that's because of efforts by the Indian boarding schools to assimilate Native people into white American culture. But in a lot of ways, that's because of the violence against Native people and the belief that Native people were some form of like a subspecies. Now, of course, this is incorrect and it's violent thinking, right? It's wrong and it's hateful. And so what's important to recognize is that even though Americans in the 1880s thought this way, it wasn't true and it never will be true. In fact, today there are over 9 million people who identify with one tribe or another, and there are over 500 federally recognized tribes. This is a picture taken recently on the Navajo Reservation here in Arizona of 2 sisters riding horseback. So American expansion, right? So you have your sort of like theoretical concepts of the West, so Manifest Destiny, Frederick Jackson Turner, those kinds of things. But there's 2 really like basic logistical ways that Americans expanded into the West. The first is through cattle, right? You have these huge cattle ranches that are taking up space in places like Montana and Colorado and New Mexico, Arizona. Really, Arizona was a place by now, actually. So you have these like large ranches, cattle industry, because the cattle industry is food, right? Cattle is actually providing food for the military, for urban giants in the north, and plantations in the south, right? So you have this huge industry of beef production through cattle. And then on the other side, you have the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So Americans now have access, right? They can actually get on a train in New York City or Philadelphia and end up in Oregon. This is the first time this has ever happened. Before, you had to take a boat all the way around South America, right? Because the Panama Canal doesn't exist, all the way up to California. That would have taken like months, and it was very dangerous. The railroad would have taken a couple weeks. So Americans have access to the West for the first time. And over the course of these decades, the West becomes mythologized. It becomes this place of like, it's like a weird combination of promise, right? The future of America, but also nostalgia, the past of America, the loss of American frontier, right? That this is, with the frontier moving west further and further, we're losing what makes America so special. And also that same concept of the extinction of Native people, the belief that we have to see them before they die out. These are really mythologized, weird kind of falsehoods that are being indoctrinated into American culture through things like Wild West shows. So this is a picture of Buffalo Bill, or you might know him as Cody, right? Buffalo Bill was this very famous guy who hired people who represented aspects of the West, like the violent West with guns and shootouts, or the mythologized West, like buffaloes and Native people. And he would take them around the country as like circuses or movies or performances. I mean, think about like going to a concert. It's like that. He would take these groups of people around the country and sort of show them off to American audiences. It's like, this is the West, right? So over time, the West comes to represent, you know, cowboys, cattle drives, violence, shootouts, bank robberies, all that kind of exciting things that you might think of in like a Western movie. That starts in the 1880s with people like Buffalo Bill Cody. In 2023, when I took this list, so I took this list in 2023 from the American Yacht, but may have been updated since, but this is the list of primary sources that the American Yacht provided in this chapter. So think about the things we just talked about today, and just looking at the title, you're a historian, right? You're investigating the West in the 1880s, right? Or turn of the century. Just looking at the title, imagine, what could this possibly tell me? What could this primary source, the perspective of someone who actually was there at the time, what could it tell me more about? We have Chief Joseph on Indian affairs. What could that tell us about? William T. Hornaday on the extermination of the American bison. What topic did we cover today that might actually address or reference? Chester A. Arthur on American Indian policy. Frederick Jackson Turner, ring a bell, the significance of the frontier in American history. Turning Hawk and American Horse on the Wounded Knee Massacre. Laura C. Kellogg on Indian education. Helen Hunt Jackson on A Century of Dishonor. Tom Torlino of the Navajo Nation. And Francis Densmore and Mountain Chief. Think about those things we just covered today. What did we talk about? Let's look back. We talked about where, when, and who is the West. We talked about violence against and persistence of Native people. We discussed American expansion, the myth of the West. Those are our big topics today. Of these primary sources, which do you think discusses what? Now, you've probably already been assigned a primary source, or you've begun investigating your primary source, so you probably recognize one of the titles from this list. What do you think your source is telling you about the American West at this time?